One arrogant host, one prepared CEO, and a red folder that would change everything. What started as an ambush became a masterclass in dignity. The autumn breeze whispered through Manhattan's steel canyons as Angela Carter contemplated the city through her office window, 40 floors above the busy streets. Her reflection stared back. An imposing figure in a tailored navy blazer, her natural hair styled in an elegant crown of braids. The morning light highlighted the discreet gray strands at her temples, medals of honor earned through years of breaking barriers in the technology industry. She checked her watch. 2 hours until her appearance on Morning Talk with Rick Thompson. Despite having led Carter Tech Solutions to a $2 billion valuation, moments like these still made her heart race with the weight of representation. Her phone vibrated with another message from her public relations team, probably with last-minute notes for the interview. Instead, it was an email that made her pause. "Dear Ms. Carter," it began, "I'm one of your mentees from the Phoenix program. Yesterday, I secured $5 million in Series A funding for my healthcare AI startup. When they asked me who inspired me to believe this was possible, I showed them your picture on my vision board." Angela's throat tightened as she continued reading, remembering her own journey from a small Harlem apartment to this penthouse office. The email continued with details about how the mentee had used Angela's strategies to navigate the predominantly white and male venture capital environment. The weight of being the first never really diminished. Every move was scrutinized, every decision questioned, every success attributed to diversity initiatives rather than merit. Angela moved to her desk, where a framed photograph caught her attention. Her grandmother standing proud in her nurse's uniform, circa 1963. "My child," she had said, "they'll tell you the ceiling is glass, but your mind needs to be steel." That advice had carried Angela through Harvard Business School, through failed startups, through boardrooms where she was often the only woman, let alone the only black woman. Now she was preparing to discuss her mentorship program on national television, a program that had helped launch over 1,000 black entrepreneurs into the tech ecosystem. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant Michael entered with a tablet showing the morning's social media metrics. The hashtag #CarterTechRising was trending, with thousands sharing success stories from her mentorship program. Stories of former waitresses becoming UX designers, taxi drivers launching successful apps, single mothers building tech empires from their kitchen tables. Each story was a testament to what happened when talent met opportunity. The data didn't lie. Her program wasn't just changing lives, it was transforming the entire landscape of tech entrepreneurship. The intercom buzzed. Her car was waiting downstairs to take her to the studio. As Angela gathered her things, she noticed a notification on her phone, a private message from one of Rick Thompson's producers. The preview was brief, but something in its tone made her pause. Through the frosted glass walls of her office, she could see her team working diligently, many of them products of her mentorship program. She adjusted her blazer, checked her reflection one last time, and headed for the elevator. Little did she know that this interview would become more than just another media appearance. It would become a defining moment in her legacy. But as the elevator descended, a cold realization ran down her spine. The whispers she had heard about Rick Thompson's controversial interview style were about to take on new meaning, and the battle she was walking into was far bigger than she had imagined. Backstage at Morning Talk, the air was heavy with a palpable tension that contradicted the typical cheerful atmosphere of morning shows. Angela discreetly observed as the production team moved with unusual nervous energy. Through the reflection of a turned-off monitor, she caught fragments of whispered conversations between producers who cast furtive glances in her direction. The studio, with its bright lights and impeccable set, seemed like an arena disguised as a living room, and Angela could sense that something was off. A young makeup artist who introduced herself as Jasmine approached for final touches. "I'm a huge fan of your work," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly while adjusting the powder on Angela's face. "My sister got a scholarship through your program." Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment, Angela saw in that young professional the reflection of all the people who depended on her. "Rick is different today," Jasmine added hesitantly, pretending to adjust the lapel microphone. He had a long meeting with the executive producers earlier. Across the studio, Rick Thompson rehearsed his characteristic smile in front of a mirror, while a production assistant handed him a red folder. Angela noticed how he leafed through it with a predatory gleam in his eyes, occasionally stopping to make notes with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Through the years, she had learned to read people like him. Public figures who masked prejudices with practiced smiles and seemingly innocent questions. The contents of that red folder, she suspected, would be the ammunition for what was to come. A silent tension hung in the air, while technicians made final lighting adjustments. Angela checked her phone one last time, finding a message from her grandmother. "Remember, dear, sometimes silence speaks louder than words." That familiar advice brought a subtle smile to her lips. Her grandmother, who had faced her own challenges as a nurse in the 60s, always knew that the most important battles weren't always fought with shouts, but with dignity and strategic intelligence. Angela put away her phone, feeling the weight of that ancestral wisdom strengthening her resolve. The director began the countdown to the show's start, and Rick finally approached Angela, extending his hand with his television smile. "It will be an interesting interview," he commented, his falsely cordial tone barely disguising a note of challenge. Angela shook his hand with calculated firmness, holding his gaze with a serenity she had cultivated through years of facing hostile boardrooms. The handshake lasted a few seconds longer than necessary, like two chess players studying each other before a decisive match. As the cameras prepared to start broadcasting, Angela realized that the whispers and glances backstage were just the tip of the iceberg. The real test wouldn't be in the questions Rick would ask, but in the carefully prepared traps she couldn't yet see. The camera's red light came on, and Rick Thompson assumed his charismatic host persona. "Today, we have with us one of Silicon Valley's most controversial figures," he began, his bright smile contrasting with the deliberate use of the word controversial. Angela maintained her serene expression, recognizing the first attempt at provocation. The studio was quiet, except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional sound of pages turning, that red folder now open on Rick's desk. The first few minutes flowed like a rehearsed dance, questions about Carter Tech Solutions' success, impressive growth numbers, awards won. But Angela noticed the small nuances, the way Rick emphasized certain words, how he subtly directed the conversation. "It's really extraordinary how your company has grown so quickly," he commented, a calculated pause before continuing. "Some would say, surprisingly quickly." The subtext was crystal clear to anyone who had ever faced veiled prejudices in corporate environments. Through the studio monitors, Angela could see her team backstage. Young faces, mostly Black and Latino, watching with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Among them was Marcus, her first mentee, now Carter Tech's Director of Innovation. She remembered the day she met him, a brilliant young man who almost gave up on his dream after countless closed doors. Now he held a clipboard with the mentorship program's latest data, waiting for the right moment to deliver them, data that would disprove any insinuation of favoritism or incompetence. Rick began presenting his manipulated graphs, projected on a giant screen behind them. "These numbers suggest a negative impact on traditional entrepreneurs," he declared, his voice taking on a tone of false concern. Angela observed the distorted lines and bars, immediately recognizing the tactics used to create a misleading narrative. Years of experience in presentations to skeptical investors had sharpened her ability to identify manipulated data. She waited patiently, knowing the right moment for her response hadn't yet come. The atmosphere in the studio grew denser with each minute. Producers moved nervously behind the cameras, realizing the interview was taking a different turn than planned. Angela maintained her elegant posture, each response measured and precise, frustrating Rick's attempts to provoke an emotional reaction. She could feel his growing irritation in the face of her unshakable composure. The questions were beginning to get more aggressive, less veiled in their prejudice. As Rick prepared his next move, quickly consulting that mysterious red folder, Angela realized the crucial moment was approaching. What he didn't know was that each biased question, each malicious insinuation, was only paving the way for a twist that no one in the studio could predict. The studio monitors flashed with live social media messages, where the interview was already starting to generate buzz. Angela noticed how the hashtags multiplied quickly. Task Carter vs. Thompson, Task Tech Equality, Task Watching History. In one corner of the studio, producers whispered frantically on the phone, probably receiving instructions from the channel's management. The tension was palpable, as if the air itself was charged with static electricity before a storm. A fragment of memory crossed Angela's mind. Her first job interview at a major tech company, 15 years ago. The interviewer had asked questions similar to Rick's, questioning her capabilities with a condescending smile. "Perhaps you'd be more interested in our diversity initiative," he had suggested, dismissing her Harvard degrees and innovation track record. That day, she promised herself she would change this scenario not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. Rick picked up his tablet, sliding his finger across the screen with rehearsed confidence. "I have some interesting testimonials here," he began, his tone falsely casual. "Experienced entrepreneurs who claim they've been passed over for important contracts in favor of, well, participants in your program." Angela kept her gaze fixed on him, noticing how he avoided using certain words, dancing on the edge of political incorrectness. Backstage, Jasmine, the young makeup artist, wrung her hands nervously, her face reflecting the tension many there felt. The next moment was like a chess match, where each move needed to be calculated with precision. "Interesting that you mentioned that, Rick," Angela responded, her voice calm but firm. "Because I have here data verified by independent auditors that show exactly the opposite." She made a subtle gesture, and Marcus approached with a blue folder, her own carefully prepared ammunition. Rick's expression faltered for a moment, as if realizing his opponent had anticipated his moves. The numbers didn't lie. Companies led by program participants had created 3 times more jobs in the last 2 years than the industry average. Innovation had increased, measured by the number of registered patents. Most impressive, 40% of new contracts were collaborations between traditional companies and program startups, creating an ecosystem of mutual growth. Angela presented each piece of data with a surgeon's precision, methodically deconstructing Rick's veiled accusations. But while the numbers spoke for themselves, something in Rick's tense smile suggested he still held a card up his sleeve. What Angela didn't know was that in the next few minutes, he would make a comment that would completely transform the course of that interview, and no one in the studio was prepared for what would come next. Rick Thompson adjusted himself in his chair, visibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. His fingers drummed nervously on the red folder while his rehearsed smile began to falter. The live studio audience, which initially seemed divided, now leaned forward in their chairs, completely absorbed in the masterful way Angela conducted her responses. The host, known for destabilizing his guests, found himself in unfamiliar territory. A young producer, hidden behind the cameras, couldn't contain a proud smile while watching Angela disarm each provocation with elegance. On her phone screen, social media was exploding with supportive comments. Executives from major tech companies were beginning to speak out publicly, endorsing the data presented by Angela. The wind was changing direction, and everyone in the studio could feel it. "But let's talk about meritocracy," Rick tried again, his voice betraying a slight tremor of frustration. "Some would say that programs like yours—" He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound explicitly prejudiced. Angela took advantage of the pause to remember her grandmother's advice. "Silence is a powerful response to those who are used to not being questioned." She waited, letting his discomfort fill the studio. The seconds dragged like hours while Rick struggled to reformulate his question. Backstage, Marcus smiled discreetly, recognizing his mentor's strategy. He had seen Angela use this same technique in countless board meetings, the power of strategic silence. The tension in the studio was palpable, amplified by the soft hum of equipment and the occasional click of camera shutters. Rick's face was beginning to show signs of redness, his usual control slipping away like sand between fingers. He looked quickly toward the program's direction, seeking guidance, but found only tense expressions. Angela maintained her serene posture, her hands elegantly crossed in her lap, emanating a calmness that contrasted dramatically with her interviewer's growing agitation. It was like watching a chess master anticipating opponents' moves, several plays ahead. In that loaded moment of silence, no one in the studio could predict that Rick Thompson was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. His next words would not only change the course of the interview, but would trigger a sequence of events that would shake the established power structures. The studio was immersed in a tense silence when Rick Thompson finally lost his composure. "Perhaps," he began, his condescending smile barely disguising his irritation. "Some people simply don't belong in high-level business. After all, how much does your company really contribute to the economy?" The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. In the audience, several people audibly gasped, while producers exchanged alarmed looks. Angela remained impassive, but her eyes shone with renewed intensity. Through the studio monitors, Angela could see social media exploding in real time. Rick's comment was already going viral, generating a wave of indignation. Marcus, backstage, had his fists clenched, but his gaze met Angela's, and he nodded slightly, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of moment his mentor had always been prepared for. Decades of experience had taught Angela that sometimes you need to let your opponent dig their own grave. The studio's air conditioning seemed to blow colder now, or perhaps it was just the chill that ran down everyone's spine. Jasmine, the makeup artist, had tears in her eyes, probably remembering her own experiences with veiled prejudice. Angela gently adjusted her blazer, a gesture her mentees knew well. It was the movement that preceded her most brilliant moments of leadership. The silence that followed Rick's comment seemed endless. Backstage, network executives moved frantically, urgent gestures being exchanged with the show's direction. Angela could see from the corner of her eye how some sponsors were already calling the network, concerned about their brand's association with the discriminatory comment. Rick, belatedly realizing the magnitude of his error, tried to maintain his characteristic smile, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. The red folder, his source of ammunition against Angela, now lay forgotten on the table. The moment was crucial, and Angela knew it. Years of experience in dealing with institutional prejudice had taught her that the response to an attack like this needed to be more than just a defense. It needed to be a transformative lesson. She leaned slightly forward, her gaze fixed not on Rick, but directly at the main camera. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath, anticipating her response. While everyone waited for Angela's next words, no one could imagine that her response would not only destroy Rick Thompson's career, but would also become a historic moment in the fight against corporate prejudice. What was about to happen would forever change the power dynamics in boardrooms across the country. Angela adjusted her microphone with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. "You know, Rick," she began, her voice conveying a tranquility that contrasted with the palpable tension in the studio. "My grandmother used to say that true greatness isn't in proving your worth to others, but in elevating those around you." She made a calculated pause, letting the words sink into the absolute silence that dominated the environment. Rick's eyes narrowed, not yet knowing he was about to fall into his own trap. "As for your question about economic contribution," continued Angela, opening a serene smile, "Carter Tech Solutions generated 10,000 new jobs in the last year alone. But more important than that," she made a dramatic pause, "is how we've inspired a new generation of entrepreneurs who refuse to be limited by outdated prejudices." The audience began to murmur in approval, while the cameras captured Rick's growing discomfort. Backstage, Marcus held a tablet showing social media exploding with support for Angela, the hashtag #CarterVsThompson already trending at #1. The decisive moment was coming, and Angela could feel the historical weight of that instant. "Actually, Rick," she continued, her voice now carrying a note of revelation, "since you mentioned contribution, we've just launched a National Technology Scholarship Program." She made a strategic pause, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made Rick shift uncomfortably in his chair. "And interestingly, your 3 children are among the beneficiaries. The entire studio froze. Rick visibly paled, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. The revelation hung in the air like silent thunder. Angela continued, her voice now carrying an incontestable authority. Your children were selected on merit, just like all other participants. Because true leadership isn't about excluding, Rick. It's about uniting. The studio erupted in spontaneous applause. In the front rows, several people stood up, including some executives that Rick recognized as network board members. The expression on their faces made it clear that Rick Thompson's reign on Morning Talk had come to an end. The moment transcended simple personal victory. It became a symbol of systemic change. As the applause continued, Angela kept her gaze fixed on the cameras, knowing her words were reaching millions of people who had faced similar situations. Rick Thompson, the host who had built his career on calculated provocations, was now completely speechless, destroyed not by an attack, but by an act of inclusion that exposed his own discrimination. And when the cameras finally cut to commercial break, everyone in the studio knew they had witnessed more than just the end of an interview. They had witnessed the beginning of a new era in the corporate world. But the true impact of that moment was yet to come, and the waves of change that would follow would surpass even Angela's most optimistic expectations. The interview that should have been just another moment in Angela Carter's career became a watershed in the corporate world. In the weeks that followed, the video of the confrontation went viral globally, accumulating millions of views and generating deep discussions about discrimination in the professional environment. The moment when Angela revealed about Rick's children's scholarships became a case study in business schools, a perfect example of how to transform an attack into an opportunity for systemic change. Carter Tech Solutions experienced unexpected exponential growth. Investors who previously hesitated now lined up to participate in the mentorship programs. But what touched Angela most were the thousands of letters and messages she received daily, from young entrepreneurs, veteran executives, and even TV hosts, all sharing their own experiences with discrimination and how that moment had inspired them to take a stand. On her desk, a new photo now accompanied the old image of her grandmother, a selfie with Jasmine, the young makeup artist, who had been accepted into the mentorship program. Rick Thompson resigned from his position a week after the interview, but what happened next surprised everyone. He sought Angela privately, not to apologize, but for an honest dialogue about his own deep-rooted prejudices. His children, deeply impacted by the public revelation, had initiated difficult conversations at home about privilege and social responsibility. The scholarship program not only transformed their career prospects, but also their worldviews. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The moment that should have hurt Angela ended up healing wounds she didn't even know existed. Carter Tech Solutions mentorship program transformed into a global movement. Technology companies around the world began adopting similar models, recognizing that diversity wasn't just a matter of social justice, but a real competitive advantage. Angela expanded the program to include not only Black entrepreneurs, but all historically marginalized groups in the tech sector. Marcus, her first mentee, now led his own division, focused on identifying talent in underprivileged communities. On a spring morning, a year after the famous interview, Angela was again before her office window. The reflection that stared back was the same, but the world around her had changed significantly. On the desk, a new photo joined the others. She and Rick Thompson, side by side at a diversity conference in Silicon Valley, where both had been speakers. It wasn't a story of villain and heroine, but of how a moment of confrontation could transform into an opportunity for collective growth. Angela smiled, thinking of how her grandmother always said that the greatest victories aren't those that defeat the opponent, but those that transform them into allies. Angela Carter's story and the morning talk could have ended in that studio, but its true impact was just beginning. In boardrooms, in emerging startups, and in the minds of future generations of leaders, a new narrative was being written. One that proved that true power isn't in breaking glass ceilings, but in building stairs so everyone can climb together.